The blood tells everything. That was what Sarah Okafor's grandmother used to say, pressing a brown thumb to the inside of Sarah's wrist when Sarah was 6 years old, feeling the pulse there like a secret. Blood remembers. The blood does not lie. Her grandmother had said it about family, about belonging, about the way a person's face could carry the whole shape of their ancestry if you knew how to look. She had never imagined she would one day stand in front of an alien species and say those exact words back to them as an argument for why humanity deserved to live. Here they were. The Orin had been in orbit for 11 days before they made contact. They did not announce themselves with blinking lights or radio signals. They did not hover over capitals or broadcast on open frequencies. They arrived the way a verdict arrives, without drama, without preamble, simply present in a way that made the preceding silence seem retroactively loud. 43 vessels, each one the rough mass of a small moon, settled into high orbit with the unhurried certainty of objects that had nowhere more pressing to be. The message came 6 hours later, not to governments, not to military installations or space agencies or scientific bodies. It came to every connected device on Earth simultaneously, in every language, parsed with a kind of syntactic precision that suggested the Orin had been listening for longer than 11 days. It said, "Your claim to this world is contested," and below that, in smaller characters, "Prepare a representative." The Secretary General of the UN spent 4 hours in emergency session before anyone thought to call the person who had, 9 years prior, published a 53-page paper in the Journal of Xenolinguistics positing exactly this scenario, down to the orbital pattern and the communication methodology, based on nothing but math, fossil records, and what she called a considered intuition about how old things behave. Sarah Okafor was 38 years old, 4'11", and had been on sabbatical in Accra when the call came. She packed a single bag. She did not pack light. She brought 4 external hard drives, 3 notebooks, and a battered thermos her daughter had painted with uneven yellow suns. She had learned, in the course of a career spent arguing about origins, that the most important thing you could carry into any confrontation was evidence. The Orion shuttle arrived at the designated coordinates, a flat stretch of the Mongolian steppe, chosen presumably because it was equidistant from several major population centers and visually unambiguous. At precisely 0600 UDC, it did not land so much as the ground accommodated it. Sarah watched from the observation platform they had constructed in 48 hours as the vessel touched down with the gentleness of something that did not need to demonstrate power because it had never doubted it possessed it. She had asked for no military escort. She had been told no. Shh. There were 12 soldiers behind her when she walked forward to meet the ramp as it descended, and she had made her peace with them, the way she made her peace with most things she couldn't change, by deciding they were scenery. The 3 Orin who descended were tall in the way that geological formations are tall. They were bilaterally symmetrical, which had surprised some people and not others. And their coloring was a deep amber shot through with darker striations that shifted as they moved, like wood grain in motion. They had 2 faces, not 2 expressions, 2 actual faces, front and back, both equally attentive, both tracking Sarah simultaneously. Their eyes, all 4 pairs of them, were the particular shade of pale gray that she associated with very old documents, the kind of gray that had once been darker. The one in the center spoke first. The translation earpiece she wore rendered it in a flat, effectless voice that was doing its best. "You are the designated representative of the species that occupies this planet?" "One of several billion," Sarah said. "But yes, I'm the one they sent today. We will address you. The question before this proceeding is whether humanity possesses legitimate origin claim to this world. We have reviewed the available evidence. Our preliminary conclusion is that you do not." Sarah looked up at them. They were 11 feet tall. She had known they would be. She had still not quite prepared for the specific reality of it. "All right," she said. "What's your evidence?" The silence that followed was long enough that one of the soldiers behind her shifted his weight on the gravel, and she heard the small crunch of it in the enormous quiet. "Our evidence," the Orin said, "is our documentation. We were here before. The record shows it." "Show me the record." Another pause. She got the impression they hadn't been asked that before. The record is not in a format your sensory apparatus can. Then summarize it for me. In terms I can work with. The soldier behind her, the one who'd shifted his weight, made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh, and then thought better of it. Sarah filed that away for later. She liked the ones who could almost laugh. The Orhan emissary. She had started thinking of it as the emissary, distinguishing it from the other two by some marginal quality of stillness it had, tilted both its faces toward her in a gesture she would later identify as the Orhan equivalent of reassessment. The Orhan seeded this world, it said. In the epoch, your science would date to approximately 40,000 of your years prior to your current calendar. We introduced genetic sequences. We introduced markers. The intelligent life that developed here was in part our doing. We have a proprietary claim based on origination. Sarah set down her bag. She crouched over it, unzipped it, and took out the first hard drive. She stood back up. You seeded genetic sequences, she said. And you believe those sequences are still present in the current human population. We believe the dominant lineages will reflect our contribution. Sarah nodded. She turned to the interpreter behind her, a young man named Kwiku, who had been translating Orhan vocalizations from the relay station for 6 days, and looked like he had not slept for 5 of them. Ku, she said. Tell them we need a data interface for the evidence presentation. They said they have a methodology for. Tell them I have one too. The data interface they eventually agreed on was a hybrid system, a large display screen erected between the two parties, fed simultaneously from Sarah's drives and from the Orhan's translation module. It looked, in the photos that would later circulate, like the world's most consequential PowerPoint presentation. Sarah had never cared about looking dignified. She cared about being right. 40,000 years ago, she said as the first maps populated the screen. Your documentation says the Orhan introduced genetic sequences to early Homo sapiens populations on this planet. I'm going to take that as true for the purposes of this argument. I'm going to take it as completely, unambiguously, documentarily true. You were here. You did something. Some version of your biology is somewhere in our biology. The emissary's 4 pale eyes were on her. The other 2 Orhan were still. That is our position. Here is mine. She advanced the display. Chondrial DNA, the genetic material passed exclusively through the maternal line, has been sequenced from over 5,000 individual humans, drawn from every inhabited continent, and over 150 distinct population groups. This is not controversial science. This is not a preliminary finding. This is 40 years of replicated, peer-reviewed, cross-validated data. She looked up at them. 99.4% of the human population traces its mitochondrial lineage to origins in Asia, specifically Central Asia, specifically to populations that crossed the land bridge between what is now Russia and what is now Alaska, between 40 and 15,000 years ago. She let that settle. The remaining 0.6% trace to European or African lineages. Both of those post-date the period you're describing. Both of those are post-Columbian admixture events in populations where they appear. None of them, none, trace to the genetic signatures your documentation describes. We have tested every inhabitable landmass on this planet. We have tested Greenland. We have tested populations that have been geographically isolated for thousands of years and show minimal admixture with outside groups. The Orhan contribution you're describing is not in the data. The emissary was quiet. That is, it said slowly, one methodology. It is the methodology, Sarah said. And I'm not done. The hard drive held 9 years of work. Not all of it was hers. She had pulled from colleagues, from archived studies, from the data sets of scientists who had no idea their life's work would one day be presented to a species from somewhere beyond the heliopause, as proof that humanity had come by this world honestly. She had not slept in 31 hours. She was running on the contents of the thermos. And on something else, something older. Something that her grandmother would have recognized as stubbornness, dressed up as rigor. Chromosome haplogroups, she continued. Paternal lineage, same methodology, same scope, same replication. Haplogroup C and Q in the male line, both traced to Asian origins. Both show the migration patterns consistent with the land bridge crossings. There is no Orhan signature in the paternal line either. She advanced the display again. The fossil record. skeletal remains from over 300 archaeological sites across North, Central, and South America, dated from before the period of your alleged seeding, show morphological features consistent with Northern Asian populations. The bone structure, the cranial formation, the wear patterns consistent with specific dietary and environmental conditions. All of it points the same direction. Asia, not wherever you came from. She paused to drink from the thermos. The yellow suns her daughter had painted on it were chipped now, worn by use. And she found herself looking at them for a moment. My daughter painted those when she was 4, she said. Not really to the Orin, to the space between them. She's 13 now. She thinks I'm in an important meeting. She looked back up. I am going to go home to her. Shh. I would like to do that with the understanding established that this is her world, that it is our world. Shh. Not because we are the strongest species making a claim to it, because we are the species that the evidence demonstrates has always been here. Blood, she said, and heard her grandmother in it, tells everything. And our blood tells a very specific story about where we come from, and there is nothing in that story that belongs to you. The emissary did not move for a long time. Second Orahan, the one to the left, spoke for the first time since the conference began. Its translation through Kui's earpiece was halting, as if the words were being shaped around some difficulty. The seating records are considered definitive by our archivists. Your archivists are working with a claim that hasn't been tested against the physical evidence in the subject population. Sarah's voice was flat, professional, not unkind. That happens. It happened to us too. We had a tradition, a very old tradition, a tradition people organized their entire lives and identities around, that said a specific group of people descended from a specific ancient lineage, and when we tested the DNA, it wasn't there. Tradition was wrong. The tradition was a story people needed to believe, and the wanting to believe it didn't make it true. She closed the display on that drive and opened the second one. The wanting to believe it doesn't ever make it true, the emissary said. You are saying our archivists were mistaken. I'm saying your archivists documented something that may have happened. Some form of contact, some limited genetic exchange, but that the evidence in the human genome does not support a claim of origin or ownership based on that contact. A landowner who once lent a neighbor a cup of flour does not own the neighbor's house. The Orin contribution, if it exists at all, is a trace. It is a cup of flour in a house that was built by other hands across 40,000 years. Another silence. This one was different in texture from the ones before it. She had been in enough classrooms, enough conferences, enough arguments, where the moment of actual reconsideration arrived to know the shape of it. It had a quality of stopped motion, like a second between question and answer, when the person asking has just realized they might not like what they're about to learn. If your data is as you described, the emissary said, it would require us to reassess, yes. The foundational basis of our claim, yes. And potentially acknowledge that our archival records contain errors significant enough to, yes. Sarah looked up at both its faces. That is what the evidence requires, and I understand that is uncomfortable. I understand that a tradition that has guided your species' policy for however many of your years this claim has been on record is not easy to set aside. I have watched human beings cry in my office because the genetic test came back showing that the story they had been told about where their family came from was not true. I have watched people argue with me about haplogroups the way they would argue with someone telling them their child was not their child. The data does not care about the story. The data is not unkind. It is simply prior to all of our preferences. She was tired. She was profoundly, bone-deep tired, in the way that you can only be when you have been holding something very heavy for a very long time, and you can finally see the table where you're going to put it down. She thought about Accra. She thought about her daughter's school play, which she had been assured she would be back for. I would like to continue the presentation, she said. Have 4 more drives. The emissary said very quietly, we will hear it. The next 6 hours were the most unusual thing Sarah had ever done, and she had once argued in front of a subcommittee of the European Parliament about the genetic implications of 6th century migration patterns, which had been its own kind of extraordinary. She walked the Orin through the complete genetic map of humanity, She walked them through the archaeological record. She walked them through the linguistic evidence. How the distribution of language families across the Americas reflected the same population movements that the genetics described. How the deep grammar of the oldest surviving indigenous languages bore the structural markers of Asian linguistic forebears, and not of any language family the Orihen translation system could match to its own archives. She walked them through the fossil record. She walked them through the climate data. She walked them through the models showing how the Ice Age population expansions had moved, in what direction, at what rate, with what genetic diversity gradients. Around hour 3, the third Orihen, the one who had been silent the entire time, standing slightly to the right and behind the other two. What she would later learn was called a record witness in Orihen legal tradition, sat down. She had not known they could sit. She had not known what it would look like when they did. It looked, in the particular slow way it arranged its several jointed limbs, like a great deal of certainty coming quietly to rest. Ku told her at the break that the record witness's posture, in Orihen legal proceedings, was the equivalent of a court reporter changing the transcript from contested to entered into evidence. She nodded. She drank from the thermos. She went back. In the 4th hour, one of the Orihen asked about haplogroup X. Was the question she had been waiting for. The one that always came up. The one that people looking for an exception always reached for. Haplogroup X was a mitochondrial lineage found in small percentages of both Native American and European populations, and for a period in the late 20th century, it had been seized on by people hoping it indicated transatlantic contact before Columbus. It did not. The branching structure of the haplogroup, properly analyzed, placed its divergence far back enough in the timeline that it reflected an ancient Eurasian migration that had moved eastward rather than westward, reaching the Americas through the same land bridge pathway as everything else. The apparent European connection was a confusion of the family tree's shape, not evidence of direct contact. Shai explained this. She showed the phylogenetic modeling. The Orihen asked 3 follow-up questions, technical and precise, that told her she was dealing with something that had genuine scientific capacity, when it wasn't relying on ancient records it had never thought to verify. That was interesting. That was, she thought, the most interesting thing. You have the ability to read this data, she said, gesturing at the display. Your questions are good questions. Built your archival system was capable of this level of analysis. The archives were constructed by predecessors, the emissary said, many of our years ago. Did they test the genetic signature? A pause. Testing was done. Against what baseline? Did they test all the living population at the time of seeding? Or did they assume the signature would propagate forward and then document only the assumption? Another pause. Longer. The record, the emissary said, carefully, documents the introduction of sequences. It does not document verification of persistence. Because they assumed. Because they believed the record to be sufficient. Sarah looked at her shoes. They were dusty from the step. She thought about the Book of Mormon, the actual documentary through which this whole framework had been transmitted to her, the film that a junior research assistant had sent her 2 weeks before first contact as a joke, saying, "You might find this one funny," which Sarah had then watched 3 times because she recognized in it the precise structure of the problem she was going to face. Tradition, a claim of origin, community that had organized its entire self-understanding around a record that said a specific people came from a specific place. Science, patient and methodical, and indifferent to the need the tradition served. Saying simply, the data is not there. She had spent a career studying what happened to people when that collision occurred. She had spent a career collecting the wreckage of the moment, when a story you needed to be true turned out to be a story. The Orihen were not so different, in this way, from anyone else who had ever held a record they had mistaken for a fact. "I want to say something," Sarah said. "That is not part of the formal presentation." The emissary waited. "The fact that your records are wrong about this does not mean that what happened 40,000 years ago didn't matter. Contact happened. Some exchange happened. Whatever you contributed, it became part of a process that eventually produced us. Not because it drove that process. but because we are built of every influence that touched the populations that preceded us. You are in our history, in some marginal way, the same way a cup of flour is in the house. That is real. It is just not ownership. She looked up at both faces of the emissary. If your species wants a relationship with ours based on what was actually true, rather than what your archives assumed, we are interested in that conversation. We are very interested in that conversation. But it starts from the evidence, not from the claim. It starts from what the blood actually says, not what we wished it would say. The record witness spoke. It was the first time, and the voice was different from the emissaries, lower, more formal, with an overtone that Quiku told her. Afterward, he was fairly sure was a legal intonation, though he'd never heard it used in a context quite like this. What it said translated was, "The testimony is noted as submitted. Record will be reviewed." Which was not a victory, she knew that. Victory would come later or not, through a process she would not be present for and could not control. What had happened here was not a triumph. It was the slow, difficult, unremarkable work of showing someone that the ground they were standing on was not what they thought it was. It was what evidence did when you gave it enough time and enough rigor and enough willingness to be in the room when the other party finally had to look at it. She repacked the hard drives. She zipped the bag. She stood up. "I'd like to go home now," she said to the room in general. No one objected. The helicopter back to the relay station took 40 minutes. She spent most of them looking out the window at the steppe rolling past below, that enormous pale grass, those shallow hills, the occasional flash of a river. This landscape had been crossed by humans tens of thousands of years ago. The genetics traced the route, mapped the approximate path of the people who had eventually populated the Americas. The people at the center of the Orahens contested claim, and they had crossed through landscapes much like this one, following game, following water, following whatever internal logic drives a species to keep moving until it has filled the world it lives in. Not because a god told them to, not because a record said they should, but because they were alive, and alive things move. The thermos was empty. She turned it in her hands, looking at the chipped yellow suns. Quiku was sitting across from her, still wearing his translation earpiece, staring at nothing with the expression of someone who had been through something he would not know how to explain for a long time. "You okay?" she asked. He turned to look at her. He was 26, maybe 27, and she thought he had probably wanted to be a linguist because he liked the idea of understanding things. And today he had stood in a field and watched understanding move in real time between a human being and a species from another star system. And it had looked exactly like an argument about spreadsheets. "I thought it would be different," he said. "What did you think it would look like?" He thought about it. More dramatic, more final, like there would be a moment where you said the thing, and they accepted it, and it was clear. "That's not how it works," she said. "Keen, with anything, evidence in front of them. And you make the case as clearly as you can make it, and then you wait to see what they do with it. Sometimes they do the right thing. Sometimes they take a while. Sometimes the record witness sits down." She looked back out the window. "You live with the uncertainty until you don't have to anymore. What if they don't change their position? Then we come back. We bring more data. We've been doing this for a while, our species. Reasonably persistent." The sun was setting over Mongolia. It was, whatever else was true about the day they had just had, a beautiful sunset. The kind that happened when the atmosphere was doing something particular with dust or humidity, or the angle of light, spreading orange and red in great strata above the horizon. Sarah watched it and thought about her grandmother and about the way the blood carries forward everything that has ever happened to a body. All the migrations and the crossings and the cold, all the movements of a species across a planet over 40,000 years. Right up to this moment and this helicopter, and the particular color of the light on the grass below. The blood remembers. The blood does not lie. She took out one of her notebooks and began writing. The Oran were still in orbit when she landed in Accra 2 days later, her daughter wrapping both arms around her waist in the arrivals hall. Face pressed against Sarah's coat, saying nothing, just holding on. The formal review was ongoing. Kwaku was still at the relay station. 3 more of her colleagues had been brought in to prepare supplementary data packages. But something had shifted. She knew the shape of it, had felt it enough times. In classrooms, in conference rooms, in the long and difficult conversations she had watched people have with the evidence of their own histories. When a story, someone had been living inside, met the thing that the data actually said, the story did not always give up immediately. It argued. It looked for exceptions. It asked about haplogroup X. But it had begun. She held her daughter and thought about what it meant to have a record of where you came from, and what it cost to get it right, and what it was worth. The blood tells everything. But you have to be willing to read it. 48 hours later, the formal Orin communication came. It did not come to every device simultaneously this time. It came to the relay station, addressed specifically to the designated representative, in a format that Kwaku later told her showed a different grammatical register than the initial message. The register, he said, that an Orin used when speaking to someone they had reconsidered. It said, "The record has been reviewed. Further consultation is requested." And below that, in smaller characters, "We were mistaken in our documentation. We acknowledge your origin claim. We would like to begin again." Sarah read it twice. Then she saved it to the 4th hard drive. In a folder she labeled simply, "Evidence, Final." She made a cup of tea. She sat with her daughter at the kitchen table, the one with the wobbly leg they kept meaning to fix. Sunlight coming through the window that faced the garden, and for a long time neither of them said anything, and it was enough. Outside, the world went about its business. The blood, as it always had, continued its patient record.